James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's a great honour to rise in this House and represent the people of Timmins James Bay, and I'll be splitting my time with the member from Abitibi Bay James Nunavik EU. I'm going to begin on a bit, maybe people think is a side issue, but I think it's fundamental to it, and it's the issue of children. We just brought home the body of 13-year-old Carla Kamawatawin to Bearskin Lake this weekend. We lost a 10-year-old there last year. And I mention her name because she died in a home with no electricity in Canada. No electricity. So, you know, we're going to sit and talk about the mental health needs of children, and we're going to say, well, how is this crisis happening? For a child to have no water and no electricity, she was ground into hopelessness and poverty. Yesterday, we just got the report on the 12 children who died in Ontario foster care. 6 in 3 months, 12 in 3 years. And I'm going to name some of their names and tell some of their stories because it pertains to what we're talking about. 12-year-old Amy Owen from Poplar Hill First Nation, whose parents said she lived in so much pain that she was broken by the age of 12. 16-year-old Courtney Scott from Fort Albany. I met her family, her sister. What they went through in the foster care system is a horror story, and nobody defended those children. She died. Chantel Fox and Jolyn Winter from Wakapika were 12 years old, and this government was found culpable in their deaths by the Human Rights Commission because it did nothing to respond to the community's urgent pleas to help those girls. Kanina Sue Turtle, who also died in care. And I don't have the names of the other children. Those are names that are protected. But what the report told us was that these children grew up with inadequate shelter, unsafe water, lack of access to food, no access to equitable education, health services, or mental health in Canada. And it said that many of them lived in overcrowded houses without electricity or running water. That is the face of the housing crisis in this country. Like 13-year-old Sheridan Hukama from Attawapiskat, and I know her family so well, who was ground into poverty from the sewage backups and living with 21 other people in an overcrowded, mold-infested home who just gave up one day and couldn't live anymore and died by suicide. The cost of complacency of this nation for the treatment of its children is being counted in the body bags that are flown home to Treaty 9 and to all the other communities of the far north. And it's the poverty that has ground them down. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, when you go into Kashechewan and Attawapiskat and the other communities, and you go into the homes, you can smell the bleach. Because the mothers and the kukums try and keep the homes clean for the grandchildren and the children. They are proud. The walls are full of pictures. And boy, when there's a graduate, those pictures are everywhere. And yet you look at the floor in the living room and everything's been moved out for the mattresses because there could be 18 and 21 people living there, sleeping there at night. That's the nature of the housing crisis. And for government, it's always an issue they're going to deal with next year and the year after. They're going to have another INAC program. They're going to have another funding plan. But the obligation to ensure that children in this country don't live in fourth world conditions, that's never been a priority. And it will never be a priority until we insist on the fundamental principle that housing is a human right. So that the 300 families in Kashechewan who have no homes, who live with their relatives and their cousins and travel around and around trying to find a bed in that little community, that they'll have homes. That is the nature of the housing crisis. And Mr. Speaker, we saw recently the government, they're coming up with all these solutions. And then one of them was they're going to have a contest for First Nations to find an innovative solution. What is this, the Hunger Games? Now, the Liberals love this stuff. They have smart city challenges, you know. They got one of their smart city challenges is they're going to use AI to help us deal with climate change. And they got an app. You've got to love Liberals. They're going to promote an app for homelessness so that homeless will know when the shelters are full. They think they are ridiculous, but they think people are stupid. So when they announce that they're going to deal with the housing crisis on First Nations, we're going to put $30 million away for the most innovative solution. and we're going to work with them, winners and losers. And I'll tell you, from having worked on this file for a long, long time, that the impediment is not the people's innovation. The impediment is government bureaucracy and government policy that time and time again shit on projects that are good, that undermine self-financing projects in communities where they can go to the bank and get their own financing, yet they have to go through the Minister of INAC because he acts like the Great White Father and he can sign off on their financial plan when they've already got an agreement with the bank. And we can have innovative housing, but you need the government as a partner. So the idea that we're going to have a smart challenge for Indigenous people to, compete for the money, to me, is probably one of the most ignorant things that I've seen from this government and shows their lack of respect. Now, Mr. Speaker, I come out of many experiences on the issue of housing. I see it across my region. I see it with seniors who can't move from the old housing that they grew up in with their kids into affordable seniors housing. It doesn't exist. A waiting list, you'll die before you ever get one. I worked in the urban centres in downtown Toronto with the homelessness before Paul Martin killed the National Housing Strategy. And when we were working with the homeless in Riverdale, in Toronto's East End, it was possible to get people into rooming houses. We still had rooming houses, and you could get someone sobered up, you could get them into cheap housing, then you could get them on the list for social housing. And the turnaround in lives. I saw it, Mr. Speaker, I know people who I spent every night of the week and the year at detox and emergency wards, and we got them stable housing. They weren't a burden on the system anymore. And some of those people that I've known over those years went on to live very good lives because of housing. But at that time, when Paul Martin pulled out of the National Housing Strategy, the housing market was already beginning to change. And the neighbourhoods in the East End of Toronto were starting to change. And Paul Martin told us not to worry because the private market, of course, Paul Martin, the king of the private market, they would step up, but they didn't step up. And we've seen a steady gap growing. So my old neighbourhood of Riverdale, which we had some amazing cooperatives that were mixed income cooperatives, where single moms and university profs lived, and these were solid neighbourhoods. But when I go back to my old neighbourhood now, it's become a neighbourhood of the super rich and the super poor. And that the balanced neighbourhoods that we had are disappearing because people can't afford. They call it the hollowing out of these neighbourhoods. So that young people who want to raise families and who work in the city can't afford to live there. And I'll give you a side example coming from the musicians community. There was a time when Toronto was the centre where all the bands went, and Montreal was sort of seen as the dance capital. Well, Montreal is the centre for music now. Do you know why? Because there's no musicians who can ply their trade in Toronto and pay the rent. So all the young artists are moving to Montreal. And you see creative communities can no longer live because they've been forced out of the city. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is mixed income. There will still be the private sector, but we need to have a commitment for housing, to build cooperative housing, to build mixed income housing, to maintain neighbourhoods where we can still have young families who can go to school and their parents can work in the inner city. But it also comes down, Mr. Speaker, to this fundamental notion that housing is a human right. And that's something this government will not recognize. They talk about it, but we had Lalina Farhar, the United States Special Rapporteur, who expressed her deep concern about this government. And what this government is doing, of course, the two great tricks of the Liberal Party in the last 150 years is, number one, all the promises they make to First Nation people, they will break as soon as the people turn their back. And the number two great trick of the Liberal Party that's gotten them in power time and time again is, vote for us in the next election and we will do something right. If you vote for us, if you return us to power, we'll look after you. So they're saying they're going to have a housing framework. But the United Nations Special Rapporteur, she says she's concerned that this government is not recognizing the right to housing in implementing legislation, and it will not recognize that the primacy of the right to housing as a legal right subject to effective remedies. So until we have a government that's willing to actually commit to that, there's no reason to believe, Mr. Speaker, that if you vote for Liberals, like you did in 1993 and 1997, 2000 and 2003, that red book of promises that's always just over the hill, just waiting for the next election, just waiting till the right moment, as long as you re-elect us, will get done. So if the government's serious, they're going to commit to that strategy as a human right. Thank you.